Her name was never written in any record. No historian noted it. No soldier mentioned it in his report. No general included it in the long lists of names that were read aloud after the war ended. She was a palace maid, one of dozens, and in the world she lived in, that was enough reason for the world to look right past her. She had worked in the palace of Varenholm for 3 years. She woke before sunrise every morning, carried heavy baskets of linen down cold stone hallways, and kept her head down the way all the servants were trained to do. She scrubbed floors and folded clean sheets, and carried trays of food to rooms she was not allowed to stay in. She listened to conversations she was never meant to hear. She learned, quietly and carefully, how the palace worked, where every door led, who held which key, which staircase was used when someone wanted to move without being seen. The palace was built on a hill above a wide valley, and on clear days she could see the hills she had grown up in. She had come from a small village in the Eastern Valley, brought into palace service when she was still young. She had no family left in the village. She had no one waiting for her anywhere. She had only the rhythm of the work, and the cold mornings, and the careful habit of noticing things. King Aldrich Voss ruled Varenholm with a steadiness that people sometimes confused for coldness. He was tall and broad, and had been alpha of all the wolf packs in the region since he was 24 years old. He had never lost a battle. He had never been seriously injured. His generals trusted him because he was always 3 steps ahead, and his enemies feared him because he was patient in a way that predators are patient. He did not rush, and he did not forget. He had walked past her in the hallway exactly once. She remembered it, because everyone in the corridor went very still when he entered, and she had kept her eyes down and pressed herself against the wall the way they all did, and he had passed without looking at any of them. That was the only time she had been in the same room as the king before the day she found him bleeding in a valley gorge. The war with the Thornfang pack had been building for months. Everyone in the palace knew it was coming, even the maids who were not supposed to know anything about the affairs of wolves and territories and border disputes. You learned things when you laundered the uniforms, and carried the dinner trays, and moved silently through rooms where powerful men spoke freely, because they did not think of you as a person who could understand what they were saying. She heard the spies 2 nights before the battle. They were dressed as palace scribes, and they had been given temporary lodging in the East Wing while they waited to deliver documents to the king's council. She was gathering linens from the corridor near their room at a late hour when she heard one of them speak in a low voice through the gap under the door. She did not stop walking. She did not change her pace, but she listened, and what she heard made the back of her neck go cold. There was a trap. The Thornfang pack had positioned a large group of fighters in the hills to the south of the main gorge, hidden from the route Aldrich's regiment was expected to take. When the king's forces advanced into the gorge, the Thornfang fighters would come down from the south and close them in. The ambush was designed to separate the king from his guard in the confusion. She reported it the next morning to the steward of the East Wing. He looked at her with the patient, slightly bored expression of someone who had many important things to do and could not spend time on a maid's worry. He told her she had probably misheard. She went to one of the junior advisors she sometimes served tea to. He thanked her politely and set his cup down and changed the subject. She went to the head of palace security, a large wolf named Commander Dern, who listened to her for about 40 seconds before telling her that palace staff should not be moving through the East Wing corridors at that hour, and that she should concern herself with her duties. 3 people, 3 closed doors. She spent the rest of that day doing her work. She folded the linen, she carried the trays, she thought about what she had heard, and she thought about the valley gorge, and she thought about the hills to the south of it, hills she had walked through dozens of times as a child, hills she knew the way a person knows their own hands. She knew where the pass was. She knew where a person could move without being seen, and she knew where the Thornfang fighters could not have positioned themselves without leaving their southern flank completely open. And she knew that no one was going to listen to her. She left before dawn through the eastern servants' gate. She wore a dark cloak she borrowed from the supply room and carried a satchel she packed herself, clean cloth for bandaging, a small knife, a water skin, dried herbs that could slow bleeding if crushed and pressed against a wound. She was not a soldier. She had no weapons training, and no armor, and no plan beyond reaching the gorge before the fighting started and finding a position on the high ridge where she could see everything. She moved through the valley in the dark, following paths she still remembered from childhood. She reached the ridge above the gorge just as the first gray light was coming into the sky. Below her, she could hear the early sounds of battle, distant shouting, the low sound of wolves moving through the trees. It went badly, exactly the way she had expected it to go. She watched from the ridge as the Thornfang fighters came down from the south and closed in on the gorge. She watched the king's regiment fall back in confusion. She watched the line break apart. She found him by following the direction the fighting moved away from. When a group of wolves breaks under pressure, they pull away from the point that is most in danger, and that point is usually where the leader was last standing. She moved along the ridge, staying low, watching, and then she saw two Thornfang soldiers moving toward a section of collapsed stone wall at the base of the gorge. She knew that wall. She had played near it as a child. She knew the slope above it, and she knew what happened to the loose rock on that slope when you disturbed the pressure point where two old formation layers met just below the surface. She did not have a weapon. She had a satchel and a knowledge of the land. She found the pressure point. She used her knife to dig into it, working quickly, and then she pushed with both hands on a specific section of the rock face. Not hard, but precisely, in the exact place that the ground had always been waiting for someone to push. The slide was small and controlled, and loud enough to make the two Thornfang soldiers stop and turn and hesitate for 30 seconds while they figured out what had happened. 30 seconds was enough. She went down the slope and found the king behind the collapsed wall. He was sitting with his back against the stone, one hand pressed against his left side where a spear had gone in. The wound was silver-laced, which meant it would not heal quickly. His face was pale, his eyes were sharp. Eyes looked at her. She looked at him. She knelt beside him and opened the satchel and said, in a calm and practical voice, that she needed him to move his hand so she could look at the wound. He moved his hand. She looked at the wound and pressed the crushed herbs against it and began bandaging it with the clean cloth from the satchel. She told him what she was doing as she did it, the way you would explain something to someone who needed to stay focused and not slip into the shock that was already pulling at the edges of his expression. While her hands worked, she told him about the southern pass. She described it clearly and specifically, where it started, how it curved behind the eastern hill, where it came out above the ridge where his regiment had retreated. She told him exactly how to get from where they were to the start of the pass, and she told him where to send the signal from the high ridge so his generals could see him and regroup around his position. He did not ask her who she was. He listened. His eyes stayed on her face. She helped him stand. She put his arm across her shoulders, and she walked with him, slowly, carefully, staying close to the wall and then to the tree line, until they reached the entrance to the southern pass. She showed him where it began. She explained the first turn. Then she let go. He looked at her for a long moment. He seemed like a man who wanted to say something, and did not have the words for it yet. She stepped back, and she picked up her satchel, and she walked away. The battle turned 3 hours later. With the king alive and back on the high ridge, the Thornfang ambush fell apart. By nightfall, the war was effectively over. It ended formally in 3 days. When Aldrich returned to the palace, he asked his staff about the woman in the gorge. He described her as best he could: small, calm, a dark cloak, a satchel, human, not a soldier. She had known the land. She had known how to dress a wound. No one knew who he was describing. The palace staff were questioned. 3 maids had left employment around that time, but none of them matched well enough. The head of palace security, Commander Dern, said that he had received no report of anything unusual before the battle, and that all staff had been accounted for. The steward of the East Wing said the same. The king went looking himself. He rode into the valley villages and asked questions badly, because he had spent his entire life being the person that everyone came to, and he had no practice being the person who came to them. He was too direct and too formal, and people went quiet around him, which made it hard to learn anything. But he was patient. Through fragments gathered over many weeks, a reference from a herbalist who recognized the wound dressing technique, a word from an old woman in the eastern village who paused just a little too long before saying she did not know, a ferry crossing logged in a border ledger that matched the right days. He built a picture. A girl from the Eastern Valley, brought into palace service young, quiet. She had left service sometime around the battle. She had gone east. He did not find her. 6 months after the battle, a letter arrived at the palace folded into the diplomatic mail. It was written on plain paper in ordinary handwriting and addressed to no one. It said that the rock slide had already been unstable, and that she had not done anything a person with sense and a childhood in those hills could not have done. It said she was well. It said not to look further east. There was no name, but on the back of the envelope, so faint it might have been unintentional, was a small mark, the kind of mark that palace maids use to identify their own linen, so it would not be lost in the wash. Each maid had her own mark, registered with the head of laundry. Aldrich brought the envelope to the head of laundry. She was an older woman who had managed the palace staff for 30 years and had an excellent memory for people who had worked under her care. She looked at the mark for a long time. She turned the envelope slightly in the light, and then, quietly, she said the name. The outline of the story ends there, on the moment the king finally hears it. What he does next, whether he goes east, what the woman built for herself beyond the palace walls, none of that is recorded anywhere, because she did not wait around to be recorded. She saved the Alpha King, not because anyone asked her to, and not because she expected anything in return. She did it because she knew something no one had listened to, and she was the only one close enough to act on it. She left before she could become a story someone else controlled. She gave only what she chose to give, including, at the end, just a name, offered quietly, from a distance, on her own terms.